I don't think I'll be able to make it back, she said. He looked her straight in the eye, nodded quickly, and said, okay, explain while we move. She was confused. What did he mean? But then she got it. Either way, you need to use your feet to get out of here, right? He asked. She sighed and agreed. Fine, I'll talk as we run. Lifa took off down the main street of Lugru, searching for a corner that would point her in the direction of Alan. Kirito and Lifa pushed through the crowds, making their way under a huge gate carved into a giant rock. As they emerged on the other side, they found themselves on another stone bridge, this one spanning an underground lake. Their boots clicked against the stones as they ran. Luckily in this virtual world, they didn't have to worry about getting tired or running out of breath. Lifa filled Kirito in on what was happening as they sprinted along. When she finished, Kirito looked ahead, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. I see, he said, deep in thought. Mind if I ask a few things? Go ahead. So what's in it for the salamanders, if they attack the leaders of the Sylphs and Kate Siths? Well, for starters, they can stop the two groups from teaming up. If the Kate Siths leader gets hurt, because the Sylphs spilled the beans, the Kate Siths will be super upset. It could even lead to an all-out war between them. Right now the salamanders are the strongest group in the game. But if the Sylphs and Kate Siths join forces, they might just become powerful enough to take down the salamanders. The salamanders really don't want that to happen. Lifa and her friends made it to the other side of the bridge and into another cave tunnel. As they ran, Lifa pulled up her map so she could see where they were going. And here's the best part, she said. If we beat an enemy lord, we get a huge reward. We'll get 30% of all the gold that's been stored in that lord's mansion. The mansion city is taken over for 10 whole days, and it's like a free-for-all. Anyone can be taxed and made to give up their gold. We're talking about a crazy amount of money here. The salamanders are now the strongest, because they pulled off an amazing trick. They used a trap to defeat the original Sylph Lord. Lords hardly ever venture out of their safe zones, and that's why they rarely get hurt. In fact, it's super rare for a lord to get killed, and although it's only happened once. I see.
She peeked over at Kirito, who was running alongside her. This is really a problem for the Sylphs to deal with, she said. You don't have to get any more involved, Kirito.
We're really close to Alness. It's just on the other side of this cave. If we go back to the meeting spot, we'll probably get caught, and have to start all over again, from Swilvain. That would be a huge waste of time, several hours down the drain. Lifa took a deep breath before saying what was really on her mind. If you're determined to reach the top of the world tree, you might want to team up with the salamanders. If their plan works out, they'll have more than enough money to make a serious attempt on the world tree. Maybe they'll even hire a Spriggan mercenary. At that point, I'd rather they just defeat me right away. She thought to herself, I won't put up a fight if it comes down to it. Normally this would be unthinkable, but she knew she couldn't beat him. Even though they'd only met the day before, she didn't want to fight him either. If things get that far, she might even consider quitting the game altogether. She glanced over at Kirito, who was still running with a determined look on his face. It's just a game, she reminded herself. Anything can happen. Kill what you want, take what you want, he said to himself. Then stopped. He had met a lot of people who thought that way, and it was getting old. At one point he even thought like that himself. But the truth is, there are some things that are more important than doing whatever you want. Even if it makes you look silly, you have to protect and respect certain things in this virtual world. I got some really good advice from someone I care about a lot. Their voice changed to a warm and gentle tone as they said, it might sound weird, but I don't think you can completely separate the person playing the game from the character they're playing in this virtual world. If you let your greedy side take over in the game, it can actually affect who you are in real life. Kirito and his character were the same person. He turned to Lifa and said, I like you. Lifa, I want to be your friend. He looked serious when he added, I would never hurt someone I care about just to get ahead. No matter what. Lifa stopped running and caught her breath. Kirito stopped too. She squeezed her hands together tightly, trying not to feel overwhelmed by the strong emotions swirling inside her. Then she looked into his dark eyes. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Lifa's thoughts clicked into place. She realized why she had always kept her distance from other players in the game. She felt like she was stuck in a video game, wondering if the people around her were real or just characters. Every time someone spoke, she couldn't help but think about what they might really be thinking behind their words. Talking to others made her nervous, and when they tried to be friendly, it felt like a heavy burden. She wished she could just spread her wings and fly away from it all. But for now, she didn't need to worry about figuring it out. She just let her heart feel whatever it was feeling. That's all she needed. And that was the only thing that mattered. "Thank you," she said softly. The words came from deep inside her. If she tried to say anything more, she'd probably start crying. Kirito smiled slightly, looking a bit embarrassed. "Sorry, I didn't mean to lecture you like that. This is a bad habit," someone said. But Kirito replied, "No way. I really appreciate it." They were about to part ways. Once they left the cave, Kirito's eyebrows shot up in surprise as he said, "I'm coming with you, of course." The other person stumbled over their words. "Huh?" Kirito quickly realized he was wasting time, and asked, "Yui, can you help us navigate while we're running?" A tiny fairy named Yui squeaked out a response. "Roger that." Kirito turned to Lifa and asked, "Can I see your hand?" Lifa was taken aback, but before she could respond, Kirito reached out with his left hand and grabbed her right one. As soon as their hands touched, Lifa's heart skipped a beat. It was the first time they'd ever held hands. In that instant, Kirito took off like a shot. They were moving so fast that a shock wave rattled Lifa's ears, like they were bursting through a wall of air. Lifa thought they had been running quickly before, but this was on a whole different level. The speed was crazy. The rock walls were a blur as they zoomed by. Kirito was pulling Leaf along and her body felt like it was flying through the air. She was bouncing back and forth, left and right, every time he made a sharp turn in the tunnels. This was not exactly the most romantic moment of her life. As they burst into a bigger part of the cave, Leafa let out a loud waz and squinted her eyes shut. Suddenly a bunch of yellow cursors popped up all around them. It turned out they had stumbled into a group of orcs. "Monsters!" Leafa tried to shout, but Kirito just charged right through the pack, without slowing down. Leafa let out a terrified scream as the monsters roared back at her. The orcs swung their crude knives wildly, but somehow none of them hit her. Kirito zoomed through the spaces between the orcs with super speed. The orcs were furious, screeching and hissing as they spun around to chase him. But Kirito and Leafa were already gone, racing down the next tunnel. They stumbled upon a few more groups of angry orcs, but Kirito didn't slow down. He kept running, dodging, and weaving through the tunnels with amazing agility. As they ran, a huge group of monsters chased after them. The ground shook beneath their feet, sounding like rushing water. This was called running a train, and it was considered really rude. Any other players they met would probably get caught up in the swarm of orcs following them. Luckily they didn't run into anyone else before they saw a glimmer of light at the end of the cave. "Hey, that might be the exit," Kirito said. But just as he spoke, Leafa's vision went completely white. Her feet lifted off the ground, and she felt herself floating in midair. "Haiji!" she shrieked, squeezing her eyes shut tight. Her legs kicked wildly, like she was swimming. But there was nothing to push against. The loud roaring sound that had surrounded her for what felt like forever, suddenly stopped. When she finally worked up the courage to open her eyes again, all she saw was sky, endless blue stretching out in every direction. Kirito had pulled off an insane move, blasting them out of the cave and up the mountain at top speed. They were flying through the air like they'd been launched from a catapult. As she looked down, all she saw was a wall of gray cliffs with nothing to catch her if she fell. They soared upwards in a huge arc, picking up speed as they went. She quickly spread her wings to steady herself and glided through the air. Finally she let out the breath she'd been holding. "Bah!" she exclaimed, still wheezing and panting. When she turned back to look at the cave, she got a chill. The entrance was packed with monsters, and it was getting smaller and smaller as they flew away. She shot Kirito a super mean look. "You just shortened my lifespan," she said angrily. Kirito just laughed and replied, "I think you mean I shortened our trip time." The girl was furious. "Dungeon crawling is all about being careful," she said. "You're supposed to take out the monsters one by one, so they don't gang up on you." She shook her head and muttered, "I have no idea what game you think you're playing, but it's definitely not this one." Leafa's heart finally stopped racing, and she took a deep breath. She looked around and saw a huge meadow stretching out below her. The meadow was dotted with sparkling lakes that caught the sunlight. A winding river connected these lakes, creating a beautiful scene. But then Leafa's eyes landed on something amazing. Beyond the river and the meadow, a massive shadow loomed in the distance. It rose up from the earth like a giant pillar, holding up the sky itself. The branches and leaves at the top were as big as stars in the night sky. Wow! Leafa whispered. Her breath caught in her throat. Kirito stood beside her, equally amazed. That's the world tree, he murmured. They were still 12 miles away from the tree, just coming out of the mountains. But even from that distance, the tree dominated the sky. It was an incredible sight, and Leafa couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder. As they floated closer, it was hard to even picture what it would be like to stand at the base of the world tree. They drifted along in silence for a bit, staring up at the tree in awe.
Kirito was the first to snap out of it.
Hey, we can't just sit here, he said. Where's this big meeting happening? Leafa thought for a moment before answering. The mountain range we just crossed over forms a huge circle around the center of the world map. Imagine 3 major paths that cut through the mountains. There's Dragon's Valley, which borders a land filled with salamanders. Then there's Rainbow Valley, home to the mysterious Undines. And lastly there's Butterfly Valley, neighboring the territory of the Kate Siths. The meeting is happening on the inner side of Butterfly Valley. She spun around and pointed northwest. To get there we need to fly in that direction for a while, she said. Got it. How much time do we have? Someone asked. The answer was quick. 20 minutes, the guy spoke up, waving his hand across the area. If those salamanders are crashing our meeting, they'll probably move from southeast to northwest, he said. The problem is, we don't know if they're already ahead of us, or still behind, so we need to hurry and hope everything works out.
Okay.
Hey you, keep an eye out for any big groups within our search area, someone said. You replied with a quick "Okay." The group was on the same page, flapping their wings and gaining speed as they soared through the air. Kirito spoke up. It's weird. Where are all the monsters? They sliced through the clouds but nothing menacing appeared. Someone explained. There aren't any monsters on the Elm Plateau, that's probably why it was chosen for our meeting. Kirito nodded, understanding now. Imagine trying to have a big meeting with important people, but then a monster shows up and starts causing trouble. It's pretty annoying. Kirito smiled mischievously at his friend. Too bad we didn't think of this earlier, he said. I could have come up with a plan to gather a bunch of monsters and lead them straight into the group that's fighting the salamanders. His friend looked at him in surprise. Where do you even get ideas like that? The salamanders are planning an even bigger attack than the one we survived in the cave. If our warning doesn't reach everyone in time, it could be a disaster. We might all get caught together and things could end very badly. Kirito thought deeply, rubbing his chin. Just then, Yui shouted excitedly, "Player signal. Get ready for a big scene ahead. There are 68 creatures gathering in one spot. This must be the salamander raid we've been warning about. And look, there are even more, 14 of them. A little farther away. They're probably the ones meeting with the Sylph and Kate Sith. These two groups will cross paths in just 50 seconds. Right as she finished giving the update, the cloudy sky cleared up, giving us a perfect view of what's about to go down. Leafa soared through the sky at the highest point she could reach. Below her stretched a vast green grassland. Far down on the ground a huge group of people marched together. They moved in perfect arrow-shaped teams of 5. Their quiet and careful steps making them seem like sneaky bombers, sneaking up on an unsuspecting target. Leafa's eyes scanned the horizon in the direction they were heading, and she spotted something interesting, the small round terrace nestled in the distance. Imagine a long table with a white strip down the middle. It's surrounded by 7 chairs on each side, making it a perfect spot for an emergency meeting. The people sitting at the table are completely focused on their conversation. They're so caught up in what they're saying that they don't even notice the danger heading their way. Leafa turns to Kirito and whispers, "We didn't make it. Even if they can somehow rush past the salamanders and warn the leaders, not everyone will be able to get to safety on time." She knew she might have to put herself in harm's way to protect the leaders. She was ready to be a shield, if that's what it took. As she stood there, she gently took Kirito's hand in hers. "Thanks, Kirito," she said with a smile. "This is where we part ways. You should head to the World Tree now." Her voice was calm, but her words were filled with meaning. She looked at him and added, "Our time together was short, but it was really fun." Just as she was about to take a sharp plunge, Kirito grabbed her arm. She looked up, surprised, and saw his usual big smile. "I don't run away from things," he said with a grin. Then he picked up Yui and tucked her back into his pocket. With a few strong flaps of his wings, he zoomed ahead. Leafa shut her eyes tight as a sudden blast of air hit her face. When she opened them again, Kirito was already diving down towards the small terrace. "Wait, what are you doing?" Leafa yelled, feeling a bit upset that their special goodbye moment had just been ruined. Kirito kept moving forward, not looking back. The person with him rushed to catch up, clearly frustrated. Up ahead, the Sylphs and Kate Siths finally saw the brigade coming for them. They pushed chairs out of the way and pulled out their swords, the silver blades shining in the sunlight. But they were no match for the heavily armed assault team. The salamanders, flying low to the ground, suddenly shot upward and stopped, pointing their long spears like hawks ready to pounce on their prey. The teams moved into position, forming a half circle around the terrace. The air was thick with tension as everyone waited for the battle to begin. One of the salamanders lifted its hand, ready to give the signal to attack. But just as it was about to do so, a huge cloud of dust exploded onto the scene. It burst up from the edge of the terrace, right between the two opposing groups, filling the air with a giant brown fog. Suddenly a deafening explosion shook the air. Kirito, a mysterious black meteorite, had plummeted to Earth without slowing down. Everyone in the clearing stood frozen in shock. As the dust slowly settled, Kirito stood up, his hands on his hips, and gave the salamanders a bold stare. He stood up straight, took a deep breath, and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Put down your swords, everyone." The sound was so loud that it made Leafa jump, even though she was still diving through the air. She winced in surprise. The explosion that had just happened seemed quiet compared to his thunderous voice. Leafa was still high up, about a dozen yards in the air, and her body tingled all over from the force of his shout. The salamander team stumbled backward, like they were being pushed by an invisible force. Their leader's loud voice was one thing, but his bravery was even more surprising. What did he think he could achieve in this situation? Meanwhile, Leafa stood tall, despite the sweat dripping down her back. She positioned herself behind Kirito, next to a group of players dressed in green, known as the Sylphs. Leafa spotted a familiar face in the crowd. It was Sakuya wearing her usual outfit. "Sakuya!" Leafa called out. The Sylph turned around and her confused eyes grew wide with surprise. "Leafa, what's going on?" she asked, sounding really mixed up. Leafa had never seen the usually calm leader of the Sylphs so flustered. "It's a pretty crazy story," Leafa explained. "The short version is that our future is now in someone else's hands." Sakuya looked even more confused. "I'm so confused." She trailed off. Then she turned her back on Leafa, and stared at a tall dark figure standing proudly in the distance. Leafa got a chance to really check out Lady Sakuya, the leader of the Sylphs. She was super tall for a Sylph woman, with dark green hair that was almost black. It fell straight down her back and was cut straight across at the bottom. Her skin was so pale it seemed almost see-through. Her eyes were long and skinny. Her nose was nice and slender, and her lips were small and thin. Her beauty was the kind that stopped you in your tracks. It was sharp and attention-grabbing. She wore a traditional kimono that opened in the front, and what made her stand out even more was the long katana tucked into her sash. This sword was actually longer than Leafa's. Her pure white legs were paired with tall red wooden sandals that added to her striking look. When you put it all together, she was absolutely stunning. It's no wonder she won over 80% of the vote in the elections. But it wasn't just her looks that earned her those votes. There was more to her than met the eye. Being in charge of a whole group of players meant she didn't have as much time to hunt, so her stats weren't the highest. But she was still super skilled with a sword, and could make it to the finals in almost any dueling tournament. People looked up to her, because she was honest and straight up about everything. Just then, Leafa spotted a small woman standing next to Sakuya. This woman had really distinctive triangular ears, peeking out of her curly, golden hair, a dead giveaway that she was a Kate Sith. This girl's battle outfit looked like a swimsuit and showed off her wheat brown skin. She had cool, claw-like weapons on either side of her waist, with 3 huge talons each. A long striped tail stuck out from the back of her suit, and it kept twitching and shaking, like it was feeling her nerves. Her big eyes had super long lashes and her nose was small and rounded. It was all pretty cute, but it also made her look really unique, compared to everyone else in ALO. Lifa had never seen her before, but she was pretty sure this was Alicia Rue, the leader of the Katesys. Just like Sakuya, Alicia Rue was super popular, and had been in charge for a long time. Behind them the fairy leaders stood with their teams, 6 sylphs on one side and 6 sis on the other. They all gathered around a long white table, looking totally shocked by what was happening. She had never laid eyes on any of the mysterious Katesys, but she knew all the sylphs were top-notch players. Just to be sure, she double-checked, and as expected, there was no sign of Sigurd. When she turned her attention back to the southern end of the terrace, where the salamanders were gathered, Kirito was yelling again. "I want to talk to your leader," he demanded. The salamander soldiers were taken aback by his fearless tone and loud voice, and they quickly stepped aside. A huge warrior walked into the empty space. He was a fierce sight with short red hair that stood straight up on his head. His skin was a deep brown color, like it had been burned by the sun. His face was sharp and pointy, like a hawk's beak. He wore awesome red-brown armor that looked super rare and valuable. On his back he carried a massive sword that was just as big as Kirito's. When Lifa looked into his eyes, she saw a fiery passion burning inside him. It sent shivers down her spine, even though they weren't standing face to face. Kirito had never met a player who commanded attention like this guy. The stranger landed with a thud in front of him, his piercing stare fixed on the young black swordsman. His face was a mask showing no emotion. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke in a deep rumbling voice. "What brings you here, Spriggan? You're going to die either way, but I'm curious, what made you think you could take us on?" Kirito stood tall and replied loudly, unafraid. "I'm Kirito, a messenger from the Spriggan Undine Alliance." "Are you declaring war on all 4 of our groups?" someone asked. Lifa was shocked. She couldn't speak. The idea sounded crazy, the worst bluff she'd ever heard. She felt sweat trickling down her back. Her face showed how surprised she was, but she tried to wink at Sakuya and Alicia Rue to calm them down. Even the salamander commander looked taken aback. "An alliance between Undines and Spriggans," he repeated, clearly stunned, but he quickly got his cool back. "You're really here all alone, without any guards to protect you?" "That's right," came the reply. "I was only visiting for trade talks with the Sylphs and Katesys, but if you disrupt this meeting things will get serious fast. All 4 groups will have to team up against you." The room fell silent for a few tense moments. The salamander wasn't convinced. "I'm not gonna take your word for it," he said, eyeing Kirito skeptically. With a swift motion, the salamander pulled out his double-sided blade from behind his back. The sword gleamed with a dark red light, and 2 dragons seemed to twist and turn on its surface. "If you can survive my attacks for 30 seconds, I might actually believe you're an envoy," he said with a sneer. Kirito just smiled calmly, and drew his own enormous sword. "Thanks for the offer," he said lightly. This dragon was a boring gray color with no cool designs on it. But when it flapped its wings it suddenly shot up into the air and hovered right next to the salamander. The space between them seemed to crackle with energy, like they were about to explode in a fierce battle. Time stood still for 30 seconds. Lifa gasped out loud. She had seen Kirito fight before, and she thought he could definitely win under these conditions.